It was the kind of quiet that made even the streetlights nervous. You know the one I mean, where the hum of the city takes a step back, like it's holding its breath, waiting to see which way the night's gonna go. I was standing by the window of my suite at the Waldorf, a cigarette burning slow between my fingers, watching the rain gloss over Fifth Avenue. They say New York never sleeps, but when you run the streets like I did, you don't sleep either, not because you can't, but because you don't dare. Back then, I was the king of the night. The speakeasies hummed for me, the gambling dens took their orders from me, and half the politicians in this town couldn't pass a law without making sure I liked the sound of it first. My boys, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, they weren't just friends, they were extensions of my will. I didn't have to raise my voice, not once. If I said a thing needed to be done, it was done. No questions, no delay, no mistakes. That's how you keep an empire breathing. The city smelled like wet brick and hot bread that night. From my vantage, I could see the neon blush of the Cotton Club sign and the way the steam from the subway grates curled like cigar smoke. Every corner was mine, or so I thought. It's a funny thing, the way you can feel invincible one minute and start hearing whispers the next. Some guy in the DEAS office, they said, was making a career out of chasing ghosts. And somehow, I'd become his favorite ghost story. Still, I wasn't losing any sleep over it. Not yet. My mind was on the numbers coming in from Jersey, the liquor shipments moving up from Philly, the dice games in the Bronx. It was all running smooth, like a well-oiled switchblade. That's when Frank stepped into the room, rain speckling the shoulders of his overcoat. Costello had a way of moving quiet, like the city itself didn't want to make noise when he walked. "They're talking about you in the papers again," he said, tossing the folded Times onto the desk. Headline was "Nothing New, Gangland Boss Linked to Vice," but the placement? Front page, right under the mayor's speech about cleaning up the city. My name sat there like a loaded pistol. I took a drag, let the smoke curl toward the chandelier. "Let 'em talk," I told him. "Talk don't hurt nobody." But Frank just stood there, jaw tight, eyes steady on mine. He'd been around long enough to know talk had a way of turning into subpoenas, and subpoenas had a way of turning into trouble. Later that night, we hit the clubs, not for fun, but for presence. You had to let people see you, feel you in the room. The 21 Club was packed, a soft buzz of laughter under the swing of the band. Waiters in crisp white coats glided between tables, sliding highballs to men who could recite my name like a prayer. Every nod, every handshake, it was part of the machine. The city had a rhythm, and I was the one keeping time. But even in that glow, the clink of ice, the warm scent of whiskey, the rustle of silk dresses, there was a shift. A certain corner table went quiet when I passed. A guy at the bar avoided my eyes. Whispers move fast in this town, and if you lean close enough, you can almost catch their tails before they slither away. Dewey. That was the name they were murmuring. Thomas E. Dewey. The name didn't hit hard at first. Another reformer, another man with a clean haircut who thought law was stronger than loyalty. The kind who came in bright and left with his pockets lined by the same people he swore to fight. But this one had a bite to his words. And the way people said his name, low but sharp, told me he was already writing a story with me as the villain. By the time I left the club, the rain had thinned to a mist, but the streets felt heavier somehow. You learn to notice these things in my line of work, the way the city breathes. That night, it was breathing slow, like it knew something I didn't. Costello walked beside me, hands in his pockets, not saying much. He didn't have to. Back at the Waldorf, I poured 2 fingers of rye and sat down, the city sprawling under me like a sleeping animal. I thought about the whispers, the paper headlines, the way certain faces had turned when I entered the room. None of it scared me. Not yet. But it had my attention. And if there's one thing you should know, it's this: once something's got my attention, I don't just sit around waiting to see how it plays out. I make moves. Quiet ones. The kind you don't hear about until it's too late to stop 'em. Still, as I sat there with the glass in my hand, watching the lights on the East River flicker like a string of cheap pearls, I couldn't shake the feeling that the game was already in motion and, for the first time in years, I wasn't the one dealing the cards. That's how the night felt. Calm on the surface. But underneath? The streets had already started whispering. And whispers in New York have a way of turning into storms. Every king's got a man out there who wants the crown, but mine wasn't another gangster. It wasn't some street boss looking to carve up my territory or a trigger-happy kid trying to make a name for himself. No, my problem wore a clean suit, shined his shoes every morning, and carried a law degree instead of a gun, Thomas C. Dewey, the district attorney who wouldn't blink even if you put a barrel between his eyes. I'd seen his kind before, the crusader type. Always with that sharp part in the hair, the pressed collar, the voice that could sell purity to a priest. The newspapers loved him. The public ate up every speech about restoring order and clearing the filth from the city. Filth meaning me and mine. I had to laugh. The same politicians who toasted me at banquets now pretended they'd never touched my hand. Dewey was giving them a new sermon to preach, and they were lining up to sing in the choir. The first time I really took notice was when Costello dropped a thin file on my desk. Inside were transcripts, not official ones, mind you, but notes from one of our guys inside City Hall. Dewey had started talking about me in his inner circle. He called me the keystone in New York's criminal arch. I liked the sound of it, even if it wasn't meant as a compliment. But then I saw the rest. His plan wasn't to come at me for bootlegging, gambling, or even racketeering. No, the man was going after me for prostitution. I leaned back in my chair, lit a cigarette, and let the smoke roll out slow. Prostitution, I said. That's his play? Meyer Lansky, sitting across from me, shrugged. He thinks it's clean. No juror wants to look soft on vice. Plus, it makes you look dirtier to the public than booze or cards ever could. It was true. This wasn't about what was hardest to prove, it was about what was easiest to sell. Dewey didn't just want a conviction, he wanted the story. The headlines. The image of the big, bad mob boss preying on the city's daughters. I could already see the front pages, Vice King caught. He started slow, like a man tightening a knot. Raids on small-time madams. Quiet interviews with working girls. A few low-level pimps brought in, sweated out, and sent back with their nerves rattled. Every piece was meant to paint me into the center of his canvas, one careful stroke at a time. I told myself it was noise, but the truth was I could feel the edges of my circle getting poked. One night, I found myself walking through Little Italy with Costello. The air was sharp with roasting chestnuts from a street cart. Kids ran between stoops, chasing each other under strings of dim bulbs. It should have been a calm night, but even here, in my own backyard, there was talk, old-timers whispering my name in the same breath as Dewey's. The city loves a fight, especially when it thinks it's between good and evil. I knew the public mood. The Depression had them hungry for heroes, and Dewey had the perfect look for it: sharp jaw, steady eyes, a voice you could print in gold. I could almost respect the guy, if he wasn't gunning for me. And that's the part that stuck, he wasn't gunning for the mob in general. He'd made it personal. We had our own ways of countering. Frank got word to a few friendly reporters, planting stories about Dewey's ego, hinting he was more interested in headlines than justice. We greased a few palms in the city council, hoping to slow down his funding. But every time we thought we'd taken some wind out of his sails, he came back harder, cleaner, and with another public speech that had housewives nodding in approval over their morning coffee. One afternoon, Meyer came to see me with a look I didn't like. "Charlie," he said, "he's good. Better than we thought. He's building this like a house, every brick solid before he lays the next one." He told me Dewey was avoiding the usual mistakes: no informants who could be discredited, no loose ends in his investigations. It was as if he'd studied our moves before making his own. I started to think maybe this wasn't going to be the kind of fight you win with intimidation. You can scare a witness, but you can't scare a prosecutor who knows the public's got his back. That's when I realized the real danger. Dewey didn't need to beat me in the streets. He just had to beat me in the minds of 12 jurors, and he'd already started working on them long before any trial. That night, I sat alone in my suite, the city stretched out below, glittering like it was wrapped just for me. But the shine felt different. Somewhere down there, Dewey was working late in some clean, paper-stacked office, and every page on his desk had my name on it. I swirled the rye in my glass and wondered, not for the first time, if this was how it started for all the kings before me, not with a bang, not with a betrayal, but with a man in a clean suit quietly making himself the storm you never saw coming. You ever feel eyes on you? Not the kind from across a bar, the kind that stick to your back, follow your steps, and don't look away even when you turn around? I'd lived with attention my whole life, but this was different. This wasn't the respect of the streets or the heat of rivals. This was the quiet watch of the law, and it moved slower, quieter, meaner. It started with little things. A sedan parked across from my building for 2 nights in a row. A man reading the paper on the corner who was still there an hour later, same page turned. The girls at my club started acting nervous, whispering when I walked past. It didn't take a genius to put it together. Dewey's boys were out there, and they weren't looking for headlines yet. They were looking for a rope to put around my neck, one knot at a time. Vice Squad detectives, they called them. They moved in pairs, sometimes 3s. Always clean shirts, hats low, nothing flashy. They'd go into a joint, have a drink, chat up a waitress, and walk out like they were just passing time. But I knew better. They were mapping my world, who came and went, what was said, where the money flowed. I had guys tailing them too, but it's like shadowboxing, you see the moves, you can't land a punch. Meyer came by one night, looking more serious than usual. Charlie, he said, they're building something. They're hitting all the houses, all the girls. Not busting M big, just shaking M up. Sooner or later, someone talks. I leaned back in my chair, watching the smoke from my cigarette twist up toward the ceiling. And when they talk? I asked. Meyer just shrugged. Then they start saying your name. And it won't matter if it's true or not. That was the game, not proving anything, just connecting dots until the picture looked enough like you. Dewey didn't need to catch me with cash in my hand. He needed a dozen scared girls willing to say they saw me, heard me, or took orders from someone who swore I did. And with the way they leaned on people back then, they'd get it. One offer of leniency, one threat about deportation, one whisper about a cell in Sing Sing, people would say anything to make it stop. I started moving quieter. Meetings at odd hours. Routes home that doubled back on themselves. Fewer faces at the table when we talked business. Still, the pressure kept building. Frank told me one of our numbers men spotted the same 2 detectives in Harlem, Hell's Kitchen, and Midtown all within a week. That meant they weren't just sticking to my turf. They were working the city like a puzzle, fitting every piece together until it pointed straight at me. Then came the raids. Not the big noisy ones you see in the pictures. These were quiet. Surgical. 2, 3 vice men would walk in, speak to the madam, and walk out with someone in cuffs before the band finished its set. No shouting, no smashed bottles, no overturned tables. Just a clean cut, like they were carving my network apart piece by piece. One night, I got word that one of the girls, a pretty thing named Millie, had been taken in. She worked a house in Midtown we kept under a friend's name, not mine. Still, she knew enough faces to make trouble. I sent a guy to watch the precinct, see if she came out. She didn't. Word was Dewey's people moved her to a safe location, which meant they were keeping her close, softening her up for court. The thing about being hunted is you start hearing everything louder. A door slam sounds like a raid. A phone ring feels like a subpoena. Even the steam hissing from a radiator can make your chest tighten. I didn't scare easy, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the weight. It's not fear exactly, more like knowing a storm's coming and realizing you don't control the wind anymore. One evening, I took a walk through Central Park just to clear my head. The city was muffled under a thin fog, lamps glowing like halos in the mist. A man in a dark coat passed me, nodded, kept walking. Nothing unusual, except he was the same man I'd seen outside the Waldorf 2 mornings ago, pretending to read the classifieds. That's when I knew they weren't just circling my business. They were circling me. I went back to the suite, poured myself a drink, and stared at the city from the window. Down there, life was moving like always, cabs honking, music spilling out of bars, steam curling into the night air. But somewhere, in an office I couldn't see, there were files with my name at the top. Statements. Maps. Lists. They were building something, and it wasn't a case you could buy your way out of. That's the thing about a quiet war, you don't hear the shots until they're already in you. And by then, you're just hoping you've still got enough blood left to crawl away. For a guy who knew every cop worth knowing, it's funny how I didn't know the ones who came for me. It was late, not the kind of late where the city's dead, but the kind where the streets are breathing slow, drunk on the night's last call. Rain had been falling for hours, slicking the cobblestones until they gleamed under the street lamps. I just finished a game of gin with Costello in my suite, the kind of night where you talk more about business than the cards, when the knock came. Not a knock exactly. More like 3 hard bangs that rattled the doorframe. I froze, not because I was scared, but because I knew right then this wasn't a friendly visit. Costello shot me a look, one hand drifting toward his coat. I shook my head. If this was who I thought it was, a piece wasn't gonna fix it. When the door swung open, they came in fast. Not clumsy. Not loud. Just precise. 3 plainclothes detectives, rain dripping from their hats, eyes sharp and cold. The lead man flashed a badge before I could even get a word out. Charles Luciano, you're under arrest. Just like that. No build-up. No speech. They moved like they'd rehearsed it, one man to the left, one to the right, the third stepping forward with the cuffs. I could have made a scene. Could have shouted about warrants, lawyers, the whole routine. But what would that do? Give the papers a better picture? I stood, smoothed the front of my vest, and put my wrists out like I was handing over a pair of gloves. You boys must be Deweys, I said. None of them answered. The cuffs went on cold, and for the first time in years I felt metal where I was used to silk. Costello didn't move from his chair. Just sat there, jaw tight, eyes following every step as they led me toward the door. I'll handle things, he said. I gave him a nod, the kind that means more than words. Outside, the hallway smelled like wet plaster and stale cigars. A photographer was already there, flashbulb ready. The light popped, and for a second everything went white. They walked me out into the rain, past the awning, down the slick steps to an unmarked sedan. The city's noise seemed far away, muffled under the steady hiss of water hitting pavement. The back door opened, and I slid in, the leather seat cool against my back. One detective sat beside me, another up front. Nobody spoke. The driver pulled away, tires whispering on the wet street. I looked out the window as we moved through Midtown. The neon signs blurred in the rain, blues, reds, yellows, like the city was bleeding color. We passed a club I knew well, and for a split second I saw 2 of my guys at the door. One lifted a hand, hesitated, then lowered it. What could they do? This wasn't a street fight. This was the law, and you don't muscle your way out of the law without paying for it twice. Inside, the car smelled faintly of gasoline and wet wool. The detective next to me kept his eyes forward, but I could feel him sneaking glances. Maybe he expected me to break, to start talking, to look scared. Instead, I lit a cigarette, cupping the flame against the window's draft. Nice night for it, I said, smoke curling up into the dim light. He didn't answer. We reached the precinct just before midnight. The building was old as stone steps slick under the rain, the lamps outside casting long, tired shadows. They led me through a side entrance, down a narrow hallway where the air turned thick and smelled of ink and damp paper. A clerk sat behind a high desk, pen scratching as the lead detective recited my name, age, and charges. "Compulsory prostitution," he said, like the words didn't need any dressing. They took my fingerprints, the black ink cold on my skin, then my photograph. No smile. No tilt of the head. Just a straight, blank stare into the lens. I could already see it on the front page: Vice King nabbed in midnight raid. Dewey would be smiling somewhere, knowing every headline was another brick in his case. After the formalities, they put me in a holding cell. The bench was metal, the walls sweating with moisture from the night. Somewhere down the hall, a drunk was singing off-key. I sat back, crossing one leg over the other, and thought about how fast the tide can turn. 1 hour you're in your suite, rye in hand, running the city without leaving your chair. The next, you're staring at chipped paint and listening to the pipes groan. But here's the thing, the night wasn't over. Arrests are just the opening act. The real show comes later, in the courtroom, under the lights, with the whole city watching. And if Dewey thought this was the end of my story, he hadn't been paying close enough attention. I'd gotten out of tighter spots than this. Still, as I leaned back on that cold bench, I couldn't shake the feeling that this one was different. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady as a clock, washing the streets clean. But no amount of rain could wash away what was coming next. In my business, the worst thing you can do is make the front page unless you bought it first. And I hadn't bought this one. The morning after my arrest, New York woke up to my face staring back at them from every corner newsstand: Vice King taken in midnight raid. The type was bold, the ink still smelling fresh, like the papers couldn't wait to tell the world I'd finally been caught. I'd been in the papers before, hell, sometimes I'd made sure of it. A little column about a charity donation here, a photograph leaving a restaurant there. But this was different. This was front page, above the fold, the kind of splash that sells out copies before noon. Every paper from the Times to the sleaziest tabloid on Mulberry Street ran the same story, just dressed in different words: Luciano's reign of vice exposed. Prostitution racket smashed. Dewey strikes blow for morality. In the holding cell, I got my hands on a copy. The photo was from the night before, me in the rain, flanked by detectives, coat collar up. I didn't look scared. I didn't give them that. But the flashbulb had caught just enough water on my face to make me look like I was sweating. I knew how it would play. By mid-morning, reporters were calling the precinct, trying to get a statement. Dewey, of course, gave them exactly what they wanted: a clean, rehearsed speech about restoring decency to New York, about how my arrest was the first step in dismantling organized vice. He didn't just name me, he painted me like a villain in a picture book, the kind your mother warns you about before bed. Frank came to see me that afternoon, eyes dark from a night of no sleep. "They're eating it up," he said. "Every column inch. The Herald, the Journal, even the Brooklyn Eagle. They've all got you pegged as public enemy number one." He set a stack of clippings on the bench beside me. Headlines screamed up at me, each one worse than the last. It wasn't just the story of my arrest anymore, it was a full biography of every rumor, half-truth, and bedtime monster tale anyone had ever told about me. I flipped through, reading the names they dragged out: girls I barely knew, clubs I hadn't stepped into in months, anonymous sources who swore I was the architect of every vice racket in the 5 boroughs. They didn't care if it was true. Truth doesn't sell papers. Stories do. And Dewey knew that better than anyone. The press loved him, the young DEA, with the square jaw, clean record, and the nerve to take on the city's most untouchable men. Every picture showed him in the same pose, coat buttoned, hat brimmed just so, a slight frown like he was carrying the weight of justice itself. It was theater, and he was playing the hero. Meanwhile, they painted me as the perfect villain: Italian immigrant, slick suits, rumored ties to every shady deal from here to Havana. They didn't need proof. They had a face and a name the public already knew. I'd built my reputation to keep people in line, now it was being used to box me in. We fought back the way we could. Frank made calls to a couple of friendly editors, tried to push pieces that questioned Dewey's motives. Was this about justice, or was he chasing headlines for a political run? Meyer suggested leaking a story about corruption in Dewey's own office, something to muddy the waters. But it was like throwing pebbles at a battleship. The machine was already in motion, and the public was buying tickets to watch it roll over me. One columnist, a guy I'd once slipped an envelope to for a favorable review of a club, wrote that my arrest signaled the beginning of the end for the Luciano era. I read it twice, not because I believed it, but because I wanted to remember his name for later. By evening, the radio stations had joined in. Smooth-voiced announcers told listeners about the dramatic takedown of the nation's most notorious crime boss, while swing music played between bulletins. I could imagine families in Brooklyn kitchens, plates clinking, nodding along like they were part of the story. Dewey wasn't just prosecuting me, he was recruiting every man, woman, and child in the city to his jury. That night, in the dim light of the cell, I leaned back against the wall and thought about how quickly the court of public opinion had been called to order. My trial hadn't started yet, but the verdict out there was already guilty. And if there's one thing worse than losing in court, it's losing the crowd before you even get there. Still, I wasn't ready to fold. Public image could cut both ways. If Dewey wanted to make me the villain, I'd have to find a way to make the villain worth rooting for. They didn't put my rivals on the stand, they put the girls. Not the kind you read about in polite society columns, but the ones who worked the rooms where the curtains stayed closed and the music was just loud enough to drown the negotiations. I'd known some of them for years, not as employees, but as part of the scenery and the life we lived. And now, one by one, they were walking into that courtroom, swearing to tell the truth and letting Dewey's men guide them through their stories. The courtroom smelled like varnished wood and damp wool coats. Reporters filled the benches along the side, their pencils scratching in bursts whenever someone said my name. Dewey sat at his table, clean as a bank ledger, his papers stacked so neat you'd think the trial was just another day at the office. I sat at mine with my lawyers, letting my face stay still, unreadable. In a room like that, you don't give them anything they can use, no smirk, no glare, no twitch. The first girl they called was named Cokie Flo, a nickname she'd earned the hard way. She walked in wearing a plain dress, hairpin tight, trying to look like Sunday morning instead of Saturday night. She avoided my eyes, but I could tell from the way she gripped the rail that she felt me watching. Dewey's questions were smooth, almost gentle, like he was giving her room to confess instead of accuse. "Did you ever meet Charles Luciano?" he asked. "Yes," she said, voice small. "He was around. Gave orders sometimes." "What kind of orders?" She hesitated, looked down. "Where to work? How much to take? Who to send the money to?" It was thinner than the smoke in the room, but the way Dewey framed it, you'd think she'd handed him a signed contract from me. My lawyer tore into her on cross, bringing up old arrests, debts, contradictions. But every answer still had my name in it, and that's all the papers needed. Then came others. Some I barely knew, some I'd never spoken to. One swore she'd seen me collecting envelopes in a back room. Another said she heard me tell a madam to keep the girls moving. None of it had proof behind it, but Dewey didn't need proof. He needed the rhythm, the steady drip of testimony that built a picture in the jury's mind. I caught one or two girls glancing at me between answers, quick little flickers of the eyes. It wasn't affection or regret. It was fear. Not fear of me, fear of what Dewey's office could do if they changed their story. That's the part the public never sees. They think these witnesses are brave souls standing up to the big bad wolf. They don't see the deals made in quiet rooms, the threats about immigration status, the promises of protection that come with invisible strings. During recess, the press swarmed outside the courthouse, shoving microphones and notepads at anyone who'd talk. Headlines the next morning were all the same: girls tell of Vice King's orders. Luciano gave directives in brothel operations. It didn't matter that the stories contradicted each other in a dozen places. The public wasn't reading for consistency, they were reading for drama. And Dewey was delivering it in installments. One afternoon, as another girl took the stand, I leaned toward my lawyer. "She's lying," I muttered. He didn't look at me. "They all are," he said quietly. "That's the point." He was right. The truth didn't matter here, only the version that fit Dewey's script. Still, I played my part. Sat still. Adjusted my tie now and then. Whispered to my lawyers at the right moments. You don't show the jury anger, you show them control. Let Dewey's parade of witnesses look like the desperate ones. Let the papers say I was calm, collected, unshaken. Even if inside, I could feel the noose getting tighter with every yes that came out of those girls' mouths. By the end of that week, Dewey had stacked so much so-called testimony that it didn't matter how many holes we poked in it. The jury had been soaking in my name for days, and human nature says you start believing the song that's been playing longest. That was his strategy, not to hit me with one knockout, but to wear me down with jabs until the bell. As I left the courtroom that Friday, flashbulbs popping like fireworks, I realized something important. This trial wasn't about facts. It was about theater. And in theater, it doesn't matter what's real, it matters what they believe. While I was trapped in that oak-panel theater Dewey called a courtroom, the real work, the kind that didn't make headlines, was happening outside. Frank Costello was the man for that job. Frankie wasn't built for speeches or handshakes in front of cameras, but he knew how to move in the shadows where deals were made and debts were collected. And in those weeks, he became my lifeline to the outside world. I didn't have to tell him what to do. Frank had been around long enough to read his situation better than most lawyers. The first thing he did was start plugging holes. Anyone with loose lips, bartenders, bookies, ex-girls, small-timers who thought they could score points with Dewey's office, found themselves on the receiving end of a quiet visit. Sometimes it was just to talk over coffee. Sometimes it wasn't. Whatever was said, they came out with their mouths zipped tighter than a banker's safe. But it wasn't all intimidation. Frankie had another side, the diplomat. He made rounds to the clubs, the restaurants, the backrooms where the other families met. He let them know Luciano wasn't finished, that this was a storm I'd ride out. Because in this business, weakness draws sharks faster than blood in the water. If the commission thought I was done, they'd carve up my rackets before I ever saw daylight again. Frankie made sure they didn't think that. Money was another matter. Trials drain it like a bad habit. My lawyers weren't cheap, and every extra arrangement we had to make with certain officials came with a price tag. Frankie kept the cash flowing, skimming from the right places, shutting down operations that were too hot, moving others under new names so the heat wouldn't trace back. He even made sure the envelope went to a couple of reporters I could still count on, not to change the story entirely, that was impossible now, but to plant a little doubt in the public's mind. Meyer Lansky was in the mix too, though in his own quiet way. Meyer wasn't a street guy. He thought in terms of ledgers, not fistfights. While Frankie worked the street angle, Meyer handled the paper trail. He had accountants shifting assets, buying up legitimate fronts, making sure that if Dewey came for my money, he'd be chasing ghosts. Between the two of them, they were keeping my empire from collapsing in on itself. Still, there were limits. Frankie told me one afternoon through the jailhouse glass, "Lucky, we can slow it down, but we can't stop it. Dewey's got this thing wound up tight. Even the judges are playing along." He didn't say the rest, but I knew that meant some of our usual methods for smoothing a verdict weren't going to work this time. Too many eyes on the case. Too many people smelling opportunity in my downfall. We also had to worry about the street mood. Some of the younger guys, eager, stupid, saw this as their chance to climb the ladder. Frankie had to make examples of a couple, quick and clean, just to remind everyone who still called the shots. One ended up in Jersey with a busted jaw. Another vanished completely. It wasn't about revenge, it was about keeping order. On the outside, the city was eating up the trial like a serialized novel. Every morning, people lined up to get the latest paper before work. Frankie told me there was even a bar downtown that played the radio recaps between songs so customers could get their fix of Luciano news with their whiskey. They made me out to be some kind of mythical villain, like I was running the entire city from my cell. In a way, that worked for me, made me look untouchable. But the risk was that if Dewey won, the fall would look even bigger. Frankie's visits were never long, the guards made sure of that, but every time he left me with the same message: keep your chin up, Charlie. Out here, we still got control. I held on to that, because in a case like this, half the fight was convincing yourself you were still in it. But I could tell by the set of Frankie's jaw and the tightness in his eyes that he knew what I knew. Control is a funny thing. You can hold it tight for years, then lose it in a single moment when the tide turns against you. And from the way the courtroom was going, that tide was getting higher every day. It was a Tuesday when Dewey played his ace. The air in the courtroom had that heavy, still feeling you get before a thunderstorm. Everyone knew something was coming. You could see it in the way the reporters gripped their pencils, in the way the jurors shifted forward in their seats. Even my lawyers, usually smooth as marble, had that tightness in their mouths. And then she walked in. Her name was Madeline, though the papers would start calling her the blonde canary by the next morning. She wasn't just another working girl, she'd been a madam in one of the more profitable houses, the kind with carpet on the stairs and mirrors that made the rooms look bigger than they were. She had style, and Dewey knew it. In a trial built for headlines, she was the perfect act for the center stage. She didn't come in looking timid like some of the others. No plain dress, no lowered eyes. She wore a blue suit, hair waved to perfection, and a little smile that said she knew the cameras were watching. I'd dealt with her before. She was sharp, always calculating her angle. And now I could see she'd found the angle that kept her out of trouble and handed Dewey exactly what he wanted. From the first question, she had the jury in her pocket. She told them how she met me, how I'd stopped by her place on business, how I'd discussed rates, territories, even discipline for the girls who didn't bring in enough. She dropped my name in every other sentence, weaving it into a story so clean you could have thought she'd rehearsed it. Maybe she had. My lawyer tried to rattle her, asked about her arrests, her deals, the money she'd skimmed off her own girls. But she had an answer for everything, smooth and steady, like she'd been coached for weeks. Every time she smiled at the jury, I could see their posture shift, leaning in, listening, almost charmed. That was the danger. You put a witness on the stand who seems like she's got nothing to gain and everything to lose, and the jury wants to believe her. The reporters ate it up. They scribbled every line she gave, and you could almost hear the headlines forming in their heads. Canary sings. Luciano named as vice boss. It didn't matter that not one piece of her story came with hard evidence. She painted a picture, and in a trial like this, that's often enough. From where I sat, I could feel the tide moving. The other witnesses had been background music, useful but forgettable. Madeline was the hook they'd remember. She gave Dewey the kind of testimony that tied everything together, whether it was real or not. And once a jury thinks they've got the whole picture, it's hard to make them see the cracks. Frank Costello came to see me that night. Through the glass, he shook his head slowly. That dame just cost us 3 jurors, he said. And she might have poisoned the rest. He wasn't wrong. In this business, you can beat lies if they're messy, if they come from the wrong mouth. But hers? Hers had just enough polish to stick. Still, I wasn't done. Trials have turning points, sure, but they also have reversals. And I'd been in tighter spots than this. The trick was to keep my composure, keep playing the long game. Because if there was one thing I knew about people like Madeline, it was that the higher they climbed in the spotlight, the harder they fell when the lights went out. The next day, Dewey tried to build on her momentum, bringing in more supporting witnesses, people whose stories were meant to back hers up. But now the game was different. My lawyers tore into each one, poking holes big enough to drive a truck through. It didn't erase Madeline's performance, but it slowed Dewey's rhythm just enough for us to breathe. Even so, I knew the trial had changed. The jury had seen their star witness, and she'd sung the song Dewey wrote for her. Whether it was the truth or not didn't matter anymore. The seed was planted. As I sat back down that afternoon, I caught Dewey looking at me, not gloating, not smirking, just that tight little expression of a man who knows he's landed a clean hit. And maybe he had. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The morning our turn finally came, the courtroom had a different charge to it, like everyone was holding their breath to see if we had anything left. Dewey had strutted his parade of witnesses for days, saving his big hit with the canary for the middle stretch. Now it was our chance to answer back, and my lawyers knew they had to make it count. We didn't start with fireworks. That was deliberate. My lead counsel, George Morton Levy, wanted to build it slow, let the jury settle into thinking it was business as usual before sliding the knife in. Our first witnesses were character types, businessmen, civic figures, even a couple of neighborhood names the jury might respect. They spoke about seeing me in public places, working legitimate fronts, never once involved in the kind of coordination Dewey painted. It wasn't meant to erase the canary's words, but to plant a counterimage, Luciano the respectable operator, not the backroom vice boss. But the real swing came in the afternoon session. That's when Levy called our surprise a mid-tier club owner named Benny the Torch Romano. Benny was no saint, but he wasn't a rat either. He had his own gambling license to protect and a grudge against Dewey's office for shutting down one of his joints the year before. When he got on the stand, Levy led him gently at first, then started unraveling the canary's story piece by piece. According to Benny, Madeline hadn't seen me in over a year before the alleged meetings she described. He swore she'd told him privately that she was working something out with the DEA to keep herself out of jail. He even claimed she'd bragged about learning her lines for court. Dewey jumped up, objecting like the floor was on fire, but the judge let enough of it in to give the jury something to chew on. We followed Benny with a couple more small but surgical hits, a bellhop from a midtown hotel who testified that on the night Madeline claimed I was upstairs conducting business, I'd actually been in the lobby for hours talking to two businessmen from Chicago, and he had the register logged to prove it. It wasn't a perfect alibi, but it was another crack in Dewey's clean wall. The tension in the room shifted. You could feel it, that slight leaning back from the jury, the reporters scribbling faster, maybe sensing a headline about the DEA's case taking a hit. I didn't smile, but inside I could feel the weight easing off my shoulders just a little. Frank Costello came that night, and for the first time in weeks, he looked lighter. "We got him thinking, Charlie," he said. And once they start thinking, they stop swallowing the whole meal Dewey serves them. But I wasn't naive. Dewey was too smart to let this rattle him for long. He still had closing arguments to tie it all back together, and I knew he'd go for the jugular. Our defense had landed blows, sure, but in a fight like this, you don't win on points. You win by putting the other guy on the mat. And we hadn't done that yet. Still, the day closed with something we hadn't had in a while, momentum. And in a long trial, momentum can be as dangerous a weapon as any witness. The trick was holding it. Because the second you lose it, the crowd turns, and in a courtroom like ours, the crowd was everyone who mattered. By the time Dewey rose for his closing argument, the courtroom felt like a theater before the last act, everyone waiting to see if the hero won or the villain fell. Dewey had that presence, the kind that made you forget he was just a man in a suit. He didn't rush. He stood there, letting the silence swell until even the jurors seemed to lean forward without realizing it. Then he began, not with the facts, but with the story. Dewey knew that trials, especially ones this public, were less about law and more about narrative. He painted me as the spider at the center of a web, every thread a brothel, a gambling den, a loan shark racket. He walked the jury back through the witnesses, each one a thread, and then tied them together with the canary's testimony like a bow on a coffin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice low and steady, "if you believe even half of what you've heard from these brave men and women, then you know Charles Luciano isn't just guilty, he's the architect of organized vice in New York City." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His confidence worked like a slow poison, seeping in, making every nod from a juror feel like another nail in my coffin. My lawyers objected here and there, but Dewey danced around it. He reminded the jury of the women who'd testified, the fear in their voices, the humiliation they'd endured. He spoke of the human cost of the rackets, the way young girls were lured, trapped, discarded. He wrapped the case in morality, not just law, turning the trial into a battle for the city's soul. And in that frame, I wasn't a businessman or a misunderstood immigrant, I was the villain keeping the city in chains. Then he went for the personal touch. Dewey stepped toward the jury box, meeting each pair of eyes. "The defense will tell you Mr. Luciano is just another businessman," he said, "but I ask you, what kind of businessman needs to hide in the shadows? What kind of legitimate enterprise needs women to sell their dignity so a man can buy another silk suit?" I kept my face still, but every word was calculated to stick, to chip away at the image my defense had built. And the worst part? Dewey wasn't relying on hard evidence alone, he was feeding them the feeling of guilt, the taste of disgust. And once a jury feels that, facts become a secondary concern. He closed with a line that would be in the papers by nightfall: "You cannot return this man to the streets without telling every gangster, every pimp, every parasite in this city that the law has no teeth. Today, you have the chance to show them otherwise." Then he sat, slowly, like a man who knew he'd left his mark. The judge called a recess before our turn. My lawyers huddled around, mapping out the final counterstrike. Levy whispered, "We hit him on the overreach, make it look like he built a castle on sand." I nodded, though part of me knew Dewey had just handed the jury the ending they wanted. Still, this was the last round, and I'd learned long ago that fights are sometimes won in the final exchange. Our closing had to undo as much damage as possible, and maybe, just maybe, make them doubt enough to hang the verdict. But looking at the jury's faces, I could tell they were already leaning somewhere. The question was, could we pull them back? When our turn came for the final word, the room felt heavier than it had all trial. Dewey had left his story hanging in the air like cigar smoke, and we had to cut through it without looking desperate. Levy stood, buttoned his jacket slow, and took a long look at the jury, not the whole box, but each face, like he was talking to them one by one. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice calm but steady, "this is not a play. This is not a novel. This is a court of law. And the law demands proof, not poetry." He didn't mock Dewey directly, he reframed the whole thing. "What you've been given is a tale with villains and victims. But the DEA forgot one important thing, the facts that make it true." Levy started walking them through the holes we'd opened in the prosecution's wall. He reminded them about Benny Romano's testimony, the contradictions in Madeline's timeline, the hotel register that didn't match her story. He spoke about how easy it is for fear and pressure to twist memories, and how deals with prosecutors can turn witnesses into actors. "When someone's freedom depends on the story they tell," he said, "how much of that story do you trust?" He didn't try to make me a saint. That would have been suicide. Instead, he leaned into the idea of overreach. "You may believe Mr. Luciano has done things you don't approve of," he told them, "but that's not the charge in front of you. The charge is that he ran a criminal empire of vice. And for that, the state must prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. If they cannot, then your duty, not your kindness, your duty, is to acquit." Then he did something brilliant. Levy turned Dewey's moral argument back on itself. "The DEA told you this case is about the soul of the city. Well, I agree. But the soul of the city is built on the idea that a man is innocent until proven guilty. That the state must meet the burden, not the citizen. If we forget that, if we let fear or outrage replace proof, then none of us are safe." He slowed down near the end, letting his words hang. "When you go back to that room, ask yourselves, have they proven their case with evidence you can touch, see, hold in your hand? Or have they given you shadows and asked you to pretend they're solid?" The last line he gave them was simple, almost quiet: "If you're not sure, you must say so, with your verdict." And with that, he sat. No theatrics, no grand flourish, just the weight of the law itself as the final note. I could tell we'd made some jurors think. Maybe even hesitate. But hesitation isn't victory. In a case like this, all it takes is one strong personality in that jury room to sway the rest. And as the judge prepared his instructions, I felt the truth settling in my gut. Whatever happened next, my life was no longer in my own hands. The jury was sent out just after noon, and the heavy oak doors shut behind them with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. That was it, 12 strangers locked in a room with my life in their hands. The rest of us were left in the cavernous stillness of the courtroom, the reporters slipping out in clusters to file speculative pieces, the spectators murmuring before the bailiff shooed them toward the hall. I stayed seated for a while, my fingers laced on the table, my eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Levy leaned in. "It could be hours. It could be days," he said. "Don't try to read it too much." Easy for him to say. This wasn't his life on the table. They took me back to the holding room, a cramped, windowless box with peeling paint and the faint stink of damp concrete. No clocks, no sense of time except the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the corridor. Every so often someone would come in with a scrap of information. "They're still talking." Or, "They asked to see some exhibits again." Each update was like a drop of water hitting a stone, not much on its own, but over hours it starts to wear you down. Frank came by, his face as unreadable as ever. He sat across from me, lighting a cigarette and letting the smoke curl lazily toward the ceiling. "Charlie, these things, they got a rhythm. If they come back fast, it's bad. If they take their time, maybe they're arguing." I wanted to believe him, but in my head every scenario played out, some ending with me walking free, others with me walking into Sing Sing. By the second evening, the tension outside had turned into a kind of circus. Reporters camped in the hallways. Radio bulletins speculated on the holdup. Some papers claimed the jury was split, others said they'd reached a verdict but the judge was holding it. None of it helped. On the third morning, Levy finally got a message from the bailiff. The jury wanted to review the canary's testimony again. That cut both ways. It meant they were focused on the centerpiece of Dewey's case, but it also meant they weren't unanimous yet. I pictured them sitting around that table, some swearing I was guilty, others picking at the holes Levy had drilled into the timeline. Hours passed. Lunch came and went untouched. My stomach was in knots. Around 4 o'clock, the sound came, that particular, unmistakable knock on the holding room door. The guard's face was a mask, giving nothing away. "They got something for you," he said. The walk back to the courtroom felt longer than any street I'd ever crossed. Every step echoed, every heartbeat was a drum in my ears. I could feel the weight of eyes on me as I entered, press, spectators, even a few faces from the old neighborhood. Levy gave me a small nod, as if to say, whatever it is, we face it standing tall. The jury filed in, their expressions carefully blank. I searched them for clues, a tight jaw here, a downcast glance there, but it was useless. The foreman clutched the slip of paper like it was a live wire. The judge asked the question. The foreman's voice was steady, but to me, it came through like it was underwater. "Guilty." The word hit like a sucker punch to the ribs, not because I hadn't considered it, but because hearing it out loud made it real in a way no speculation could. The foreman read through each count, and with each guilty, it was like the air got heavier, the walls closing in. I kept my face still, the way I'd learned in the streets. Never give him the satisfaction of seeing you fold. But inside, my pulse was pounding so hard it felt like my heart might break through my ribs. Levy didn't flinch either. He leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "We appeal. This isn't over." His voice was low, clipped, the sound of a man already moving to the next fight, even as this one went down in flames. Dewey sat across the room, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp. He knew what this meant, not just for me, but for the whole order of things. This wasn't just a win. It was a message. You could be untouchable for years, but sooner or later, the law could catch you if it wanted bad enough. The judge set the sentence without ceremony, 30 to 50 years in state prison. No dramatic pause. No sympathy in his tone. Just the numbers, like reading an address. I heard a gasp somewhere in the gallery, maybe from one of my guys, maybe from someone who thought the jury would hang. Flashbulbs went off as the guards stepped in close. The cuffs clicked around my wrists, cold steel, final. I stood, letting them guide me toward the side door. The walk felt longer than it was, the sound of reporters shouting questions chasing me like a pack of dogs. Lucky. Lucky. Any last words? I didn't give them the headline they wanted. Just kept moving, eyes forward. In the hallway, Frank was waiting. His face was a mask, but his eyes had that flicker, the kind that said he was already calculating the fallout. "We'll take care of things on the outside," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. That was the thing about men like Frank, no matter what the law said, the life didn't stop because you were behind bars. They put me in the transport van, the metal benches cold against my legs. As the engine started and the city streets slid by through the barred window, I thought about the years ahead. Prison wasn't the end of the road, not for me, but it was a different kind of game, one with its own rules, its own power plays. And I'd have to start learning them fast. Still, one thought kept circling in my head, stubborn and clear: they'd gotten their verdict. But the story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot.